Thank you, Mr. Hunar Gandhi. It's an honor and privilege to introduce our chief guest, Mr. Patanjali Keswani today. Mr. Keswani graduated with a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from IIT Delhi in 1981. He subsequently received his postgraduate diploma in business management from IIM Calcutta in 1983. Mr. Keswani joined the Tata Administrative Service TAS in 1983 and worked with the Tata Group for 17 years. His last assignment was as a senior vice president of the Taj Group of Hotels. He subsequently worked with the management consulting firm A.T. Kearney as director in their New Delhi office, anticipating the enormous yet latent demand for mid-market and economy hotels in India. Mr. Keswani promoted Lemon Tree Hotels in late 2002. He is currently the chairman and the managing director of Lemon Tree Hotels Limited, which owns and operates 80 hotels in 48 cities with 8,000 rooms and nearly 5,500 employees. Lemon Tree Hotels is listed on the National Stock Exchange of India and the Bombay Stock Exchange on 9th April 2018. Mr. Keswani is focused on offering opportunities to Indians with disability and people from economically and social weaker segments. Presently, about 17% of Lemon Tree employees are from this disadvantaged segment of the population. Lemon Tree Hotels has been presented with a national award by the President of India for the best employer of persons with disabilities in 2016 and 2011, and a third national award in 2012 for being a role model in providing a barrier-free environment to persons with disabilities. Mr. Keswani is also the chairman of the Skills Council for Persons with Disability. He is also the member of the Sector Skills Council for Hospitality, Travel and Tourism. He was recently also a member of the University Grants Commission and a member of the Board of Governors of IIT Delhi. Mr. Keswani has been awarded the Distinguished Alumni Award by his alma maters, IIT Delhi in 2011 and IIM Calcutta in 2012. Mr. Keswani was inducted into the Indian Association of Tour Operators Hall of Fame in 2019, the Hotelier India Hall of Fame in 2012, and the Federation of Hotel and Restaurant Associations of India Hall of Fame in 2010. He received the Excellence Award for Inclusion and Diversity and the Condé Nast Travelers Readers Awards 2018. Mr. Keswani is a first-generation Indian entrepreneur. His father was an Indian Railway Service officer, and his mother was a doctor in the Indian Army. He was married to Saranita. They have two children, a son Aditya and a daughter Nayana. He lives in New Delhi. There will be a Q&A session immediately after the address by Mr. Keswani. You may type in your questions in the chat window during this speech. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Keswani to deliver the address.
And good afternoon, Chairman, Director, Professor Nag, the other faculty, and the incoming batch of, I think it's the 57th batch. I was just calculating that I was, I think, the 18th batch. So that was 39 batches ago. But it seems like just yesterday. So when I was listening to you, Shri Krishna, I felt that what you said was so valid, that life goes by very quickly, and it seems just like yesterday. And in that balance sheet, it is so important for you to look back and smile at what you did. There's a saying that anything you do, you should be able to look yourself in the mirror and smile if it's published in the papers the next day. So anyway, Anju, the director, asked me to address you folks. We didn't really speak about a specific topic, but I was just asking myself that, if I was a kid back in IMC, what is the one lesson I feel is, the single lesson? I didn't want to get into many subjects. What is that single thing that is crucial for success in your life, both professionally and personally? And I thought I'd entwine that with the coronavirus, which is a very topical item. So we are going to talk about the coronavirus and the second item, which is resilience, right? Now, resilience, I think, is something absolutely vital for us to inculcate. And I will explain what I mean by resilience shortly. It is not going to be taught to you, obviously, in your classes. Though, Anju, you may consider actually doing case studies on that. But resilience, I mean very simply, is the ability to absorb and bounce back. Okay, and you're going to face, obviously, in your lives, there are going to be multiple times when you'll have to face adversity, and the ability to bounce back, to recover, is something I find astoundingly not really prevalent. I find most people quit. You know, resilience is don't quit. And I find most people quit somehow here. You see, it's not the problem, it's the approach. So I would like you, I mean, we'll discuss this a little more in detail. I'll give you a case study on it. But resilience is, I think, the first and most important uh, attribute you need to develop in yourselves, right? Now, let me start with the first topic, the coronavirus, which I find very interesting, by the way, because I see what it is doing to our across the globe. So let me start by telling you humanity has, what is coronavirus? It is a pandemic. In the past, there were multiple epidemics and few pandemics, right? And I'll tell you why it has become a pandemic. But you have to keep in mind a pandemic is really an epidemic across the world, right? So humanity has faced regionally and globally many epidemics and the occasional pandemic in recorded history. So in recorded history, actually the earliest epidemic really was the epidemic, what was called the plague of Justinian. Justinian was the greatest Holy Roman Emperor of then Byzantine, now then Istanbul. He's the guy who built the Hagia Sophia, for those of you who are history buffs. And this was 4th century AD. And it killed a lot of people, but we don't know how many exactly. The most deadly plague in history in terms of impact on society was the Black Death, the bubonic plague of 1457. And this one, I'm told, killed between 25 to 60% of the European population. Imagine 1 in 2 people died in this plague. Okay. Now in recent history, and I'm talking the last 100 years, we have had, excluding the coronavirus, 2 epidemics and 1 pandemic. The biggest was, of course, the Spanish flu. And amusingly enough, it was called the Spanish flu, not because it originated there. It also originated, by the way, in Mongolia, which is part of China, in a part of China. And the Spanish flu was called Spanish because the Spain reported it very directly, did not be opaque about it. So therefore, they got the moniker Spanish flu. It affected 500 million people. This was, by the way, in the middle of the First World War. And the real outbreak was from spring 1918 to spring 1919. It affected 500 million people. The population of the world then was 1.5 billion, about 20% of today. And it killed 50 million people. Okay, let me bring it to current numbers. If the population, of the world today is 5 times, that means it would have killed 250 million people, 250 million people, if it had occurred today. So that was the Spanish flu. Then there was the Asian flu of 1957, 2 years before I was born. This was an epidemic which killed 1 million people. 10 years later, in 1968, there was another epidemic called the Hong Kong flu, which killed 2 million people. So these were the 3 large virus outbreaks, all were influenza based, in the last 100 years. And now we have, of course, the coronavirus. Now, what was the common feature in all of these? That is the most important thing, okay? The common features of all 3 were, there was social distancing practiced. There was the wearing of masks. People used to wear gloves. There was an emphasis on hygiene. No cure or vaccine was found. But interestingly enough, in all 3 cases, in those localities, people got herd immunity, and I'll explain that. And within 3 years, everything came back to normal. Everything. There was total panic. Stock markets collapsed. People thought it was the end of the world. A bunch of, Christian fundamentalists actually said the Messiah is coming. Stuff like that. But in 3 years, everything came back. So I'd just like to briefly cover a vaccine and a cure. So basically today, there is, there is a perception that it is there is very high mortality in this disease, high death rate. But the reality is, if you look at studies done by the Yale Medical School, it is sub 0.4%. And even in India, after they saw the autopsies and the results of death in Italy, which was done by the Italian government, I am told that the protocol for cure has reduced mortality by 75%. So really in any vaccine, in any epidemic, you start with a vaccine. A vaccine basically immunizes at least 75% of the population. Then the therapeutic side is the cure. So that 25% who do get it, less than 0.2% die. Okay, so right now we have no line of sight. And in the earlier three epidemics, by the way, there was no line of sight on either a vaccine or a cure. So what happened was herd immunity. Herd immunity means when a large enough percentage of the population, it is right now being debated whether it is 25% or 75%. It's somewhere in between. If a large enough percentage of the population gets the disease, then they stop becoming transmitters. And therefore the disease flattens and dies out within a period of time, not instantly. So the broad point I'm making is that everything in 3 years will come back to normal. I was very happy when I heard Sri Krishna say that on campus you will be at least 1 year, but hopefully 1.5 years, which means reading between the lines, he hopes that in the next few months, you guys will be able to go and be together, which is such an important part of your education. Now, I believe that those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Okay, so while being careful, you should also realize that in 2 years, maximum 2.5 years, because 6 months is over, we are all going to go back to normal. And coronavirus 19 is not unique in any way. I mean, I know it mutates, but so did 1 or 2 of the others. The only difference I find with this virus vis-a-vis the earlier viruses are 3 things. First is, never before in history has travel been so instantaneous and so global. So carriers are going all over the world. So that is why it became a pandemic. Earlier, it remained an epidemic, amusingly enough, because people were not traveling. Second is the global instant communication platforms that we have. So hundreds of millions of people are getting thousands of messages, fake news, real news, God knows what. But what it's created is a total climate of fear and of panic, actually. The third most interesting thing I feel is that never before in history has every single government, every pharmaceutical company, and every research lab in the medical research space focused on a single disease as is happening now. So I think probabilistic theory doesn't apply because frankly, in the past with all viruses, very rarely has a vaccine come. Okay, and the sphere of a vaccine, as you folks should know, is that you can have a vaccine get immunized to a virus, but you don't know the side effects it can have on the rest of, on you. So therefore, while a vaccine comes, I think a lot of people will be hesitant to have it initially because, it normally takes 10 years to identify the side effects, right? But be that as it may, a cure is 100% in the next 3 to 6 months, which means fear of death will go, though fear of infection will not. So then the fear will be, my God, I don't want to get this disease because I'll have to end up in hospital for a week to 2, perhaps. You may, of course, just hang out at home. Now, let me talk about resilience. What is the current situation? As I said, the current situation is one of utmost fear, panic, and it's fear of both infection and death. So people are not traveling, and then if they're traveling in such a limited way because they don't want to get infected. So this, which is actually a health crisis, has now translated into a global economic crisis. And demand for most discretionary items has become close to zero. Okay. So again, linking back to a point, you see, most economic consumption today globally is not linked to needs, it's linked to lifestyle. Keep that in mind. Okay. Those of you who want to be marketeers and work in FMCGs, keep in mind that 90% of what you spend is not required for living. It's required for lifestyle. Okay, that's why we call ourselves a consumerist society. So this lifestyle component of consumption has really crashed, right? Whether it's luxury, whether it's brands, whether it's restaurants, whether it's hotels, vacations, what have you. So as a result of this, the discretionary consumption sector has been decimated. And among the worst affected in this spectrum of consumption is the travel and tourism sector. You can see what's happening to airlines, okay? It is equally bad in hotels, equally bad in restaurants. Nobody's going to restaurants, nobody's going to hotels, nobody's going to airlines. Now, I I want you to talk specifically about hotels because I will now link it to resilience. In the last 5 months, 60% of all branded hotels in India have shut down. Demand has dropped by 90%. Okay. So the remaining 40 that are there are also taking only 10%, distributing 10% among themselves. So what do you do in a sector like hotels, which has got very high capital intensity? It's very expensive to build. It has debt normally on its books. And it has very high fixed costs, mostly in the form of its people, because it's really a service industry wrapped around real estate. Demand is destroyed so catastrophically. Normally, profitable hotels start losing enormous sums of money. And recent studies have shown that at least 80% of the hotels in India are in danger of being shut down if this continues for another 3 months. So imagine, so this is linked to the supply chain, and I'm going to cover supply chain also, which is linked to resilience a little later. But broadly, the point I'm making is that if this continues for a certain period of time, you are going to have a very real chance that your business has to shut down. And thousands of employees, by the way, it's not 5,500, we have 8,000 employees, we have 1 employee per room. There is this danger that they will all lose their jobs. So let's apply now our principle of resilience to this situation, okay? And I just want to tell you how we looked at it, because I find interestingly, when your back is towards, you're cornered, your back is to the wall, and let's assume you are resilient, you have this approach that I'm going to find a way out. It is also the father of innovation. Okay, you do things you would never have thought of doing. And the biggest problem, as you guys will discover when you start working, is that innovation is difficult to implement when it is across an organization. It is easy to innovate as an individual, very difficult to align everybody to innovate across an entire organization. And when I was in A.T. Kearney, I remember A.T. Kearney was a spin-off of McKinsey many years ago. And McKinsey was the strategy consultant. A.T. Kearney used to talk about strategy execution. And the 2 key things, if there was a pillar of thought, a thought process in A.T. Kearney, one was that average strategy with great execution trumps great strategy with average execution, number 1. Number 2, execution is always the key. It is always where companies fail. Number 3 is that nobody changes unless the pain, because changing implies pain. If I tell any of you, listen, from tomorrow you will write with the hand you do not use, you're not going to listen. You're not going to follow that out. When will you follow it? When the pain of that is less than the pain of not changing. Suppose I tell you, write, suppose you are a southpaw and I say write with your right hand, and you refuse to write with your right hand, obviously. But I give you an electric shock every time you don't, and a severe shock. After some time, you will start writing with your right hand. Okay. Sorry, I'm a left-handed guy. Therefore, I take that as the context. Roughly 7% of the world is left-handed. So it would be interesting, Anju, to study and find out how large is the batch? How many people?
480.
Okay. So if this theory is right about 34 people, 34 people should be left-handed. Anyway, so if you must make the pain of change less than the pain of not changing. That's the key to execution, by the way. And of course, when there is when survival is at stake, then pain is 0 compared to not surviving. So the key question I want to take you through is my thought process. So if I say we are a resilient company, then what do we do to survive in the short term and by which I mean to be the last man standing? See, in any environment, you can at most be the last man standing. And that is the thought process we went through about 5 months ago when this hit us initially. So what I find works is scenario planning, which is the start of strategy, which is what happens if your revenue drops by 40%, 60%, 80%. So you have to plan on scenarios. And for each scenario, you must have not less than 3 plans. So one other thing I have learned in my life is planning is all well and good, but never have only one plan, especially for important actions that you take. Always have a plan B. In fact, preferably have a plan C. Whenever in Lemon Tree, we take a major policy decision or a major investment decision, we always have up to 3 plans. Plan A, if that doesn't work, we will do B. If that doesn't work, we will do C. And this is actually embedded in our DNA, and I think is one hallmark of resilience. So you define your strategy based on different scenarios, because your actions will be very different if you are doing, a drop of revenue of 40% versus a drop of revenue of 80%. And once you define these strategies with plan A, B, C, and D, you do a second very important thing, and that is something I heard Sri Krishna also talking about, which is set your boundary conditions. So let's go back for a minute. You decide various scenarios may occur, A, B, C, D, in times of high uncertainty and volatility. Within each scenario, you decide 3 plans, okay, because the situation evolves. And then you have boundary conditions, which is, in my opinion, the ethics of a company. You see, a company is nothing but culture. Culture is the personality of a company, how you work in that company, do's and don'ts. So those of you who have not taken a job in the past, who have come directly from college, when you go to a company, you will find that there are peculiar aspects of that company that define how you should work there. What you should do, what is not to be done. So they are the do's and don'ts of the company, how you work in that company. So here, if you set, what we do is we set what's called boundary conditions, which is those things we will absolutely not touch, the must-haves within these strategies. So the 2 must-haves we had was, first, we will not lay off anybody. We have 8,000 employees now. Like you guys, I come from a similar background. My parents were in the government. I was tyrannized by a job. I joke about it, though I have great relationships with the Tata Group. That tyranny of a job means I get up in the morning, I have to go to work. I don't have a choice. If I want to sleep in late, I don't want to go to work. It's not easy to do, right? So the tyranny of a job, actually, when people ask me, why did you become an entrepreneur? I say, really, it was the tyranny of, and the tyranny of my needs, right? So when people work with you, and out of these 8,000 employees, I learned I didn't know this. I was ashamed to realize that 7,200 get only 40% of the total wage bill. And 800 get the other, about 50, and 10% is like general expense for welfare and so on. So what we decided was that come what may, we would not lay off any of those 7,200. We would not fire them. We would pay them their salary, which means 40% of our highest cost, which is the fixed cost of people, we would not touch. Therefore, to save money, obviously, we asked all our senior guys that, listen, folks, we are not, you see, one senior guy is equal to 30 junior guys. So the senior guy told, guys, you're paid better, you can afford better, you can afford to take a pay cut better. So everybody took a 50% pay cut in Lemon Tree. All these 700 guys, and I took a 100% cut, and in between some guys took a 70% cut. What I'm broadly trying to say is that the knee-jerk reaction of many companies is to lay off very junior people. But you need very large numbers for it to be material. And ultimately, when things normalize, because remember, resilience is not planning only to survive, it is planning to thrive. So you must, as a CEO, you must have a view. My view is 3 years from now, after this panic subsides, there are going to be far fewer hotels in India. So there is short-term demand destruction, but it is going to lead to long-term supply destruction. So what happens when demand bounces back is there'll be fewer hotels and they will get much more demand. Okay, sure. Some business might be affected due to the work from home / Zoom meetings may reduce on face-to-face basis. But my theory is that will be marginal. Demand will come back, supply will have shrunk. And when that happens, let me be smart. Let me have access to my trained associates. So it makes business sense. Plus, in India, I genuinely believe if an organization does not have a social conscience, I think if it does not contribute to the country, it's a total failure. Okay. So we will not lay off any staff. That was the first boundary condition. The second boundary condition, again, as a socially conscious company, was the following. See, what worries me about the coronavirus is what I call the law of unintended consequences. So take a company like Lemon Tree. We have 500 crores in cash lying in our balance sheet. I'll survive sooner or later. I want to be efficient and survive, but we'll survive. We'll pay our debt. We'll do all that stuff. However, in today's world, all companies operate at B2B level, which is they do business with other businesses, B2B. They do businesses directly with customers, which is B2C. They have intermediaries, so it's B2B2C, like we deal with Make My Trip, which then directly deals with customers. So we are in interconnected world. Many of my suppliers are also my customers, right? Now, what you need to do is you need to keep the ecosystem alive. My biggest concern is that 31% of India's GDP is with the medium, small, and micro enterprises. Okay. But 45% of India's employment lies there. What's happening in these small companies? These are companies with turnover of 5-10 crores. They've got 100 employees. They don't have orders. The few customers that are there are larger companies are not paying them because they are doing cash flow management by not paying them. So the second boundary condition was, in our system, we will pay all our MSME vendors within 30 days. There were only two boundary conditions I said. So that one is a cash flow issue. One is actually a smart business decision. So what we really said is that the ideal strategy should not only lead to survival in the short term, but should actually enable us to bounce back much harder when things normalize. Okay. So what is your strategy ultimately? It then becomes very simply reduce your fixed costs, because 70% of the costs of a hotel company are fixed. So not only reduce it, variabilize it within these two boundary conditions for different scenarios. Scenario A, B, C, which is actually in hotels, by the way, for Lemon Tree, revenue dropped 80%. Okay, think of it this way. My profit used to be 30%. So in $100 revenue, I used to spend 70 and make 30. But that 100 became 20. So we had a simple theory. In our scenarios, we said, come what may, each scenario is at each drop of revenue, our expenses will be less than equal to that revenue. So I know many people in IIM are mathematically smart, right? So I'm going to explain this. If $100 of revenue becomes $40, then $70 of expenses have to also drop to 40, which is roughly 40%. Scenario one. If revenue drops 80%, then $70 of expenses have to come to 20, which means expenses have to drop 70%. Each of them require different levels of intervention, and to achieve that, you have different plans, plan A, B, C, D. Okay, so it's a matrix. Basically, revenue drop is your y-axis, and plan A, B, C, D is your x-axis. And so we did all this, and we said we are going to reduce our fixed costs, variabilize it to the extent possible. Number two, we are going to have enough cash that we do not become a non-performing asset with our banks, because as I said, we are a capital intensive business. Lemon Tree currently has debt of about 1,1700 crores. So I need 200 crores a year to service it and to repay my debt. Third is we do not lay off any employees. Fourth is we pay all our small vendors. So this was broadly our strategy. And last was, of course, at a time like this, we implement new processes and systems. We have 300 SOPs, by the way, for hygiene, safety, security of employees, guests, visitors, and vendors. So we reach out and communicate. So our loyalty base is about 1.5 million people. So emails, information, reach out and reassure your customers. Now, if you can execute such a strategy, and as I mentioned to you in the past, implementation is 100 times more important than, like they say, money talks, bullshit walks. In my opinion, strategies can be bullshit, but execution is money. Okay. If you can execute this, you will not only survive, but emerge stronger, more innovative, and with permanent benefits. Because what we discovered was we had 1 employee per room. We had 8,000 employees. We reduced 30% of our services, but we reduced 60% of a bunch of our employees have gone on leave, to their hometowns. About 2,500 are staying in hotels. What we found was that we improved our productivity by 1.5 times. Okay, which means as we grow, we don't need to hire more employees. And the benefit there for us, we calculated, is roughly 120 crores a year. When things come back, our profit will be 120 crores more than it would have been before this crisis. So the law of unintended consequences. So I want to tell you a little story. See, I'm a guy who loves talking anecdotes. So the 2 or 3 things I want to just share with you is, first is, of course, a little bit of business. There are 3 types of people. So when something happens, there are people who watch what happens. There are people who wonder what happened. And there are people who make things happen. Unfortunately, and this is a reality, the people who make things happen are very, very, very few in number. If there is one piece of advice I'll give you with resilience, it is try and be of the last category. So resilience is not taught in class. You must consciously inculcate it. And that's a never say die attitude, which will work in your professional lives and your personal lives. And do follow it out. 2 other anecdotes I'll share with you. So somebody asked, why did we go into focusing on employees, what we call actually opportunity deprived Indians? So if you have not read a book called The Man Who Knew Infinity, it is on Ramanujan. I would very strongly urge you guys to read it. So I'll link this up. Somebody asked Warren Buffett, what makes you the world's most successful investor? And he very modestly said, I am a winner of the ovarian lottery. So what he meant was, he explained that he was born to the right parents in the right place at the right time. Right? Now, nobody is born to the right or wrong parents, but certainly you can be born in a place at a time when you do not have access to opportunity. And in those cases, you need serendipity to get you to be successful, because you are battling the odds like, very, very few people without resilience, actually. So when I heard this, I asked myself, what about people who are losers of the ovarian lottery? And I did a quick back of the envelope study with my strat team. And we said there are 400 million Indians who, due to circumstances entirely beyond their control, it's as if it is their destiny, they are born without opportunity. You see it with your migrant labor, the children of migrant labor who will never have opportunity. You see it with my agricultural contract farmers, okay, their kids. And if we as a country don't have the heart to help them, and you guys will be uniquely positioned to help them in your jobs, because you will all have an opportunity to employ people, then don't expect the government. No government can successfully do it. Okay. So our ODI initiative, Opportunity Deprived Indian Initiative, started very simply as follows, that we will split the job roles of Lemon Tree horizontally. Normally you define a job role vertically. There is this part which is customer relationship management, dealing with customers. There is this part which is skilled. There is this part which is semi or unskilled. So what we do is, instead of one guy doing this, we have 2 guys, one guy doing the highly skilled, one guy doing the semi-skilled. So we created about 1,500 such positions, and we hired about 700 people who are physically disabled, 100 people who are intellectually disabled, and about 700 people who are Angutha Chaps, which means they are either not educated or up to a level where they can just, their signature is their thumbprint. All of them had very high productivity. And what we discovered was that, in the entire organized sector in India, there are only 50 million employees out of 500 million Indians who need jobs. We went after the other talent pool. And whether it is your personal satisfaction, whether it is how your employees react, initially they may resist, but ultimately they become part of it. Or whether it is your customers, ultimately it's a brand builder. It is socially positive, it is emotionally positive, and it is economically positive. Then why are we, more of us, not doing it? So I evangelize on that. Last one, Winston Churchill, not a man I admire, but even so, once said, if you're 20 and not a communist, you have no heart. And if you're 40 and not a capitalist, you have no brains. So I would like you guys to be 30 all your lives. And with that, I wish you a wonderful learning experience in IIM. I hope it is as good as mine, because if I remember right, and I shouldn't say this, on the last day of IMC, I got trashed with 4 friends and we sank the last boat. You'll probably still find it outside the jetty. Don't send me a bill,
You're
Anju, please.
responsible for that. Now we know.
So all the best.
So,
We're with you.
respected Mr. Keswani, Mr. Sri Krishna Kulkarni, Professor Seth, Professor Piyush Mehta, faculty members, students, officers and staff, ladies and gentlemen, I, on behalf of IIM Calcutta and the entire fraternity, extend a very hearty vote of thanks to Mr. Patanjali Keswani for his inspiring talk to our incoming batch of MBA and PhD students. This talk, in fact, has become a real case study on how to keep a industry afloat in these trying circumstances. And I think it becomes your first live case study at this institute. Thank you very much, Mr. Keswani.
Thank you.
And also thank you, Mr. Sri Krishna Kulkarni and Professor Seth, for adding your comments, your valuable comments to that case study.
Thank you, Professor Nag.
Thank you both.
I would also like to thank Talent Sprint for organizing the event, the Student Council President, Mr. Gandhi, office bearers of the Student Council for the enthusiastic support for the MBA office, the Chairman MBA, Mr. Professor Piyush Mehta, officers and staff of the MBA office, ensuring a useful orientation program for the incoming batch. Lastly, I wish to take this opportunity to wish our young friends of the incoming batch a very successful and exciting and memorable experience here at IIM Calcutta. Thank you very much.